We are using, as opposed to the webinar feature of WebEx, where you are all in listen-only mode, we are using a meeting version where you all have the potential of unmuting yourselves and being on camera. I would ask that there's a lot of people on this call, more than 100, about 150 people registered. So I'd ask that you keep yourself muted for the, the entire event. And then if you'd like to be unmuted to ask a question in the final half-hour Q&A period, raise your hand and we can unmute you to ask questions. We'll try to figure that out. The chat is available for questions the entire time. We'll individual report outs for each of the subgroups from the technical advisory group. And we should have a few minutes after each of those for questions that come in the chat during their session, during their presentations. And then I mentioned at the end, you can either ask questions, raise your hand to speak, or you can use the chat for Q&A at the end. And then I'm going to post right now the link to the project webpage in the chat. So if you want to, we've actually already posted the slide decks from today's presentations on the website. So you can go get those at any point to share with colleagues. After this event is done, we'll post the webinar and the recordings of the sessions. Here's a quick look at our agenda. Anthony Fryer from the Minnesota Department of Commerce is going to give some overview of the project goals, refresh everyone where we've been for the last year working on this, and talk about next steps. Then we have 3 presentations from 3 subgroup representatives, and we'll save time for Q&A at the end. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Anthony Fryer to talk about the project history.
Thanks, Carl. Good morning, everyone. As Carl mentioned, my name is Anthony Fryer. I'm the Conservation Improvement Program Supervisor here at the Minnesota Department of Commerce. And for those of you that are sort of attending from out of state, or as Carl mentioned, if it's your first time in this process, the Conservation Improvement Program in Minnesota is the implementation of the state's 1.5% energy efficiency resource standard that we have about 120 utilities that are required to meet that. And I manage a team that helps with the implementation and regulation and technical assistance around that project. I did want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. I think the Minnesotans that are on the call are probably happy to be virtually attending this meeting, as we've got snow on top of ice and plummeting temperatures and things like that. So I think it's saved us all a sort of hair-raising drive to a meeting location had we been doing it in person. So happy to be doing it virtually today. Just also wanted to thank the US Department of Energy at this point. They are the primary funder of this project, and our project officer, Monica Andrews, has been a great resource for Carl and I as we've been working through this project. So over the next 5-10 minutes, I just wanted to give a recap of the purpose of the project for those that are attending for the first time, or for those that are just rejoining us for first time in a while. Talk about where we are in the overall timeline, and then outline the next steps that we have. So just in terms of the project goals for this particular study, they are to examine the benefits and concerns of increasing electrification as a tool for grid optimization, energy efficiency, and emissions reduction in Minnesota, to convene a series of stakeholder meetings to provide information, facilitate discussion, and solicit recommendations on key electrification topics. If we can go to the next slide, Carl. So this is just an outline that we presented at the first meeting back in January last year of our stakeholder engagement plan for this project, and it sort of has 3 phases built into it. Stage 1, which is represented by the sort of 2 boxes on the upper left-hand side of the slide there, is basically the sort of level-setting educational portion of the project that took place between sort of January and September last year, where we were introducing the purpose of the project, and then really getting a good sense from speakers around the country as to the sort of efforts that are taking place regarding electrification around the country. So we heard from representatives from the California Energy Commission, the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships, Rocky Mountain Institute, the Electric Power and Research Institute as well. And I think that was hugely helpful, certainly for the department, and hopefully for stakeholders as well, just to get a better sense of how electrification is being treated in other parts of the country. The second part of this project was to really work with about 20 to 25 stakeholders that had the time and the interest and the ability to sort of dedicate a good portion of their work to this project over the sort of late fall and into the latter part of last year to participate on technical advisory committees. And so this, through this process, we tried to break down the sort of electrification umbrella into three sort of subcategories, and that was electrification technologies, grid modernization or grid impacts of electrification, and then electrification metrics. And so we split the technical advisory committee into these three groups to talk about issues surrounding that topic specifically. And what those committees were tasked with was to look at what should stakeholders understand about a particular topic, what needs more research or clarity, what are the policy implications that arise through that particular area, and then whether or not the technical advisory committee has recommendations based on their conversations in that area. And so each of those committees met 3 times for 2 hours. Each meeting went the full 2 hours, and there was plenty to discuss, and the conversations, I think, were both informative, helpful, and hopefully the reports back today will reflect that. So that process concluded towards the end of last year, and now we're going into sort of stage 3 of the project now, which is the report development. And so that will be reviewing the findings from the Technical Advisory Committee, which we'll hear from today, and then Michael's Energy and the Department of Commerce spending the next few months developing a written report based on everything that has taken place to date as part of this project. Go to the next slide. So just stakeholder engagement by the numbers over the past 13 months. This will be our 4th stakeholder meeting. We've had 11 technical advisory committee meetings, over 350 attendees that have participated in one way or another. Over 500 hours contributed to the technical advisory committee process from stakeholders in 37 industry expert presentations to stakeholders and technical advisory committee groups. And you know, I don't have numbers from other stakeholder processes that we've conducted over the past years, but this would certainly be up there just in terms of the level of contact around this subject, and then the participation from stakeholders has been outstanding. And you know, if we're looking for sort of silver linings from everything we went through in 2020, being able to attend these meetings virtually and being very used to these sort of platforms now has been really helpful, and I think facilitated perhaps more discussion than would have taken place had we been doing it face to face. Next slide. So certainly wanted to take this opportunity to thank all the participants in the Technical Advisory Committee. I won't name all of them, but you can see the list of organizations that dedicated a significant amount of time to the process, and we're certainly the Department of Commerce, and I'm sure the US Department of Energy is extremely grateful for the effort that these organizations put forward to help us sort of tackle and address this subject in the fourth quarter of last year. Next slide. So one of the things I just wanted to highlight today was new electrification-related projects that the Department of Commerce has recently announced funding for as a result of our last Conservation and Applied Research Development Grant RFP cycle, which concluded in the fall of last year. For those of you that aren't familiar, the Conservation Applied Research Development Grant Program, or CARD, funds about $2.5 million worth of projects each year to help the natural gas and electric utilities in the state to meet or exceed the energy savings goal that they're required to meet through the Conservation Improvement Program. We announced last week the funding of 22 new studies, and 5 of them that I wanted to highlight here have sort of immediate relevance to electrification, and hopefully will help plug some of those research gaps that were identified through the technical advisory committees. So I'm just going to go down these one by one and just give a brief explanation on them, just so that you have a better idea of what they entail. The first project involves air-to-water heat pumps, a cold climate solution for high-efficiency cooling, space heating, and water heating that will be conducted by Center for Energy and Environment. And this will characterize available air-to-water heat pump systems and the best configurations to serve Minnesota residential load priorities, and measure the energy savings and cost effectiveness for heating, cooling, and hot water loads. The second study involves quantifying energy efficiency opportunities of radio wave grain drying systems, and they'll be carried out by GDS Associates to quantify energy savings that can be achieved using radio wave grain drying compared to conventional grain drying technology in Minnesota's agricultural sector. And I know that was a subject that certainly came up in some of the technical advisory committees that I was involved in. The third study is a field study of ground source technology in retrofit applications in urban or space-constrained commercial buildings. This will be conducted by Michaels Energy. And this is a field study and engineering evaluation of a novel ground source heat exchanger technology that's appropriate for retrofit applications for urban commercial buildings without space for traditional well fields, including non-traditional cooling only building system applications. The fourth project is a cold climate variable refrigerant flow demonstration and market research will be conducted by Slipstream. This will demonstrate cold climate air source variable refrigerant flow systems in Minnesota buildings and provide market, product, and program research aimed at increasing market penetration and lowering market barriers. And then our final project is heat pumps for AC units. This is energy savings and modernization of single-family cooling systems. This is another study by CEE, and this will investigate the potential for cold climate air source heat pumps as a direct AC replacement, including examining the technical and market barriers and market recommendations useful utility programs to overcome those barriers. So these studies are now underway or about to commence and will take place over the next sort of 1 to 3 years, depending on the length of the project themselves. But I did want to just highlight those because it was something that we were only able to announce last week, and as I said, it certainly has relevance to a lot of the discussions that we've had and continue to have. Next slide. So in terms of the next steps for the stakeholder process, comments and feedback and questions around this process I certainly welcome emailing Carl at the address on the screen there. Will certainly be the best first step to do that. And we're aiming to collect any additional input by March 1st and go into our development of the final report after that. Plans are underway to work with a few stakeholders on additional white papers to explore some specific and underemphasized facets and perspectives with regards to electrification. We're able, in a limited capacity, to issue sort of micro grants to help with the funding of these white papers, and are hoping to fund about 4 to 5 that will be developed and completed over the next few months, and included either as an appendix or I'm not entirely sure of the format yet, but included in the final report out later this year. And then we'll be working on writing the summary report and hope to publish that in July of this year, and then we'll hold a final stakeholder event to go through that report. Next slide. So at this point, we're going to hand over to our main group of speakers for today. And these are representatives from each of the technical advisory committee groups to report back on the findings and certain issues that were discussed by those groups. And certainly want to start off by thanking this group of speakers for summarizing those conversations and reporting back today. For the technology subgroup, Travis Hinck from GDS Associates will be giving us a presentation. For the metrics subgroup, Grace Staples from the Mendota group will provide us the update there. And then finally, on the grid impact subgroup, Jenny Edwards from CE will provide us with that update. So at this point, I will hand over to Travis Hinck of GDS Associates to talk about the technology subgroup.
All right, thanks, Anthony. I'm going to switch over to sharing here in just a second. There we go. And there we go. Okay, so like Anthony said, I'm Travis Hinck with GDS Associates. I'm going to summarize and report out on some of the things that we discussed in our technology subgroup meetings. Let's see here, turn off virtual. Okay, for those of you who may have listened to the committee report out in December, this is mostly the same content, but we've had a little bit of time to let the ideas sort of marinate, and we've noticed some of the patterns that we want to highlight as we sort of zoomed out and took a higher level consideration of the discussions that we've had. So most of the same stuff, but sort of repackaged for a different audience and maybe with a new spin on it. So this is the group of people who were members of the technology subgroup. And I want to thank everybody. There were a lot of really good conversations that we had, and a lot of learning opportunities here. And it really made it easy to summarize all of our conversations because there were so many good ones. The difficulty was paring it down to the most important stuff, but there was certainly a lot of good content. So thanks to everybody. I'm going to start with sort of the big theme that we noticed from these conversations. And here it is on this slide. There's maybe if there's only one concept that you take away from today, this might be the most important. And the key is that promoting electrification technology is more about adoption than innovation. And that is, there's certainly room for improving electric end use applications and devising new ones through research and development efforts. Like Anthony mentioned, a couple of the projects in the CARD pipeline, and those are certainly important for finding new applications and improving them. But for the most part, there are already a lot of mature electrified end use technologies that are nowhere near market saturation in their current state. So there's plenty of room for implementing electrification even without technological advancement. So that's one of the big keys that we came across in this group. So early in our conversations, we sort of wanted to define, what is electrification technology? And, roughly speaking, it's any energy consuming end use that's typically accomplished with non-electric energy source, but can be converted to electric. And we identified over 50 technologies. Actually, I think it was closer to 75. Some of them show up here on the slide. And if you're interested in more detail, Carl's going to be sending out a copy of this presentation that has more detailed notes, and I assume it'll be in the final report too. So I encourage you to check those out. But a lot of our discussion was focused on heat pumps, since that's like the most obvious electrification technology that most people immediately think of. And we think it's also likely the technology with the most potential to displace non-electric energy usage. So along with electric vehicles and maybe heat pump water heaters, they make up a big chunk of what we think of as electrification. But there are also a lot of other technologies that aren't as obvious. Home appliances for home cooking or commercial grade cooking as well. Lawn care equipment like lawnmowers, leaf blowers, or agricultural equipment like the radio wave grain drying we talked about earlier. And there's a lot of heat recovery options too that can feed into electrification. So there's a wide variety of technologies that fall under the electrification umbrella. So when we were talking about these, we sort of broke them into 4 summary topics. The first one here is focused on contractors. And it's what we came up with is that contractors are the key link to implementing electrification technologies. And there's a lot of good content in the discussion summaries that Carl will circulate after the presentation. So I encourage you to check those out again. But I'm just going to kind of touch on some of the high-level findings quickly. So the lesson about contractors being the key link applies the most, we think, to heat pumps, as we said that was what we were kind of thinking about. And I had an anecdotal experience when I had a heat pump installed at my house a couple of years ago when my air conditioner went out. The contractor, we asked them about heat pump option, and the contractor didn't seem interested in doing. They were like, why would you want to do a heat pump? It costs a little bit more. It's just not what they're familiar with. It's not their, we had to wait 2 more days for the product to be in stock. So there's just a lot of inertia in the market from non-electrification technologies. And to overcome that is not, developing new electrification technologies. It's just a matter of the contractors being aware of and being experts on and selling these products to their customers. And so this is sort of, the big note here is that contractors are the key link to possibly the bottleneck towards to unlocking electrification deployment. And then there's a lot of related issues with workforce training and with contractors learning how to sell or how to explain the advantages of electrification. And it's sort of a chicken and egg issue between, contractors don't have always the technology in stock or the desire to install the electrification technology, and customers don't know that they want it because the contractors aren't telling them about it. So it's a matter of if customers aren't asking for a product that the contractors aren't recommending, who's got to start the prime the pump on overcoming that chicken and egg issue. And so I think the point is that there's not really resistance to electrification on the part of the contractors. It's just a matter of inertia. Which suggests that well-designed utility programs and policies or small changes, here and there can really help drive contractor engagement and adoption by their customers. So it's, it identifies a barrier, but also lends itself to a solution as well. The second topic that we came across is that different strategies and approaches help under-resourced communities have access to electrification. The point here is that we should think about how to leverage electrification and deployment in a way to benefit low-income and under-resourced communities and ensure equitable access to the benefits. And really the point is that there are some electrification technologies that inherently lend themselves well to addressing equity concerns. These were some of the high-level takeaways we had. There are certain technologies that can be targeted through programs pretty well to either at a neighborhood or based on the feeder level, and they can more easily be targeted to low-income or income-qualified customers than other technologies. And there's a lot that we can learn from existing utility efficiency programs and others that can be built into potential electrification programs as we design those. And especially when we're talking about workforce training, like we talked about on the previous slide, or reaching out to contractors, there's an opportunity here to include an equity component to those discussions. And I think really what this is pointing to is that we're really at the ground level for building electrification programs and policies, and we can think now about how to optimize electrification from an equity standpoint. And the nature of many of the electrification technologies lend themselves toward furthering that equity goal. And so the fact that we're talking about it now means that it's a good time to start building in those considerations. Here's the third topic, which is new construction electrification offers unique opportunities compared to existing buildings. One comment that we got from one of the commenters during the discussions said that new construction of homes are solved if we think them out correctly. That is, there is no real technology barrier, and the costs are favorable if you do the math right for all electric homes, and the math checks out. And so really the barrier to electrification in the new construction market segment is customer perception and familiarity and comfort with electrification as an option. And one of the big savings from doing an all electric home is that you don't have the cost of installing a gas meter or having a gas account, which is just something that is not what most homeowners are familiar with. And so it's just overcoming that familiarity barrier. It's not a question of technologies need to solve a problem or the cost, because if you do it, if you do the cost right and you present the value and the cost benefit proposition to the homeowner, it does lend itself well to the electric option. It's just a matter of overcoming that perception issue. And in particular, in this case, what we're talking about is new construction, because if we can get to new construction homes, it's much easier, much lower upfront cost, and much better value proposition over the lifetime of the home if we're considering electrified options during the new construction, during the construction phase. So that's the point here, is that new construction should be a specific and separate target of any electrification programs. Okay, so in the fourth topic, this kind of picks up where we left off with new construction, but it applies more broadly to all electrification, and that is that cost is, unsurprisingly, one of the biggest barriers and one of the the key considerations when it comes to electrification. Cost is always an issue with any product, and electrification is no different from that. But the unique value proposition here for electrification is it makes cost a little bit different of a barrier than you might think of typically, just because it's not necessarily just an upfront first cost versus comparing different options. It's sort of a complicated and depends on specific situations to understand the total and lifetime costs of electrification technologies. And so, part of the conversation is that it obviously has to be cheaper by some metric in order to attract a lot of customers to participate or adopt electrification technologies. And in electrification, we know that you have to focus on the life cycle costs as opposed to the upfront costs. But the real difficulty is communicating about what those costs are, because electricity costs over time, especially depending on your rate and how you use your appliances. It can be more complicated than most other purchases or decisions that consumers make. And this ties back to what we talked earlier about training contractors to explain the value of electrification technologies, and in sort of overcoming that comfort level with consumers and becoming more familiar with the expected costs. And really, when you think if your furnace goes out or your air conditioner fails, that's a perfect decision point where you may be considering an electrification option, But that's actually right then when you're considering the first cost, that's when the value proposition is going to look the worst. And it's also a time when if you're in an emergency situation where you need a new furnace right now, that's not probably when you're going to be considering complicated cost value propositions. And so the trick is that we need to plant the seed to sort of get people considering this before they're at the decision point and need to make a decision immediately, that this is something that takes a little bit of groundwork to establish the cost value proposition and get customers familiar with it. So there are a lot of issues here, and there are a lot of potential solutions to those issues. And we discussed things like financing options and creating tools for customers to help better understand the value of electrification. The key point is that stakeholders who want to promote electrification should find ways to communicate better about costs and benefits of electrification. It can be complicated, and it depends on the specific situation. And again, we have a lot of specific notes that will be in the slide deck that Carl circulates after the meeting for more specific, and maybe we can cover some of them in Q&A if you're interested. But the high level thing is that we need to be planting the seed now. And so all those conversations sort of summarized into a list of barriers to adoption. And we have, the contractor awareness and expertise, the customer awareness and the need for them to develop a demand for electrification technologies, the cost of ownership and cost benefit proposition, especially for new construction, are different or not. I mean, we think that especially in new construction, there's an opportunity because the cost benefit math works out so well. And then just the perception of the technologies and the comfort and familiarity among customers. Those are the main barriers to adoption. And then the key, going back to that main discussion point that we started with, is that we note that research and development and market readiness are not major barriers for most of the main electrification technologies. There's still room for improvement, as we keep saying, but those are not major barriers. For the most part, the technologies are there, and they are valuable if we find the right places to promote them. And really, the barriers are these other items on the list here, and the technologies are market ready. And then we also, in each of these discussion topics, we talked about potential policies or potential recommendations to either overcome the barriers or for future discussion points for things to talk about that would help advance the electrification cause. And this is a very high level summary of some of these recommendations. But again, I encourage you to check out the final report that Carl's going to circulate. These are some of the high level recommendations, and we recommend focusing on utility and workforce programs that should start with engagement and awareness and training, rather than developing technologies. That stakeholders should consider right now as we're building electrification initiatives, how to build them in a way that is equitable across all customers. And we should be developing tools now to help communicate about electrification technologies in terms of cost value in sort of user-specific ways rather than broad market level, because each user in each situation is unique, and that changes the cost-benefit calculation. And then communication about the value of electrification at a high level is important, and to just increase familiarity among consumers so that they know to ask the question when their contractor comes and say, what are the electrification options? And then fall back on the other recommendations here where the contractor can use the tools that we're developing in parallel to help specific customers in specific situations to adopt electrification technologies. And I think that's the end of my presentation. I don't know how much time we have for Q&A or if I should just turn it back to you, Carl.
Thanks, Travis. Yeah, we have, I think, 3 minutes here for any clarifying questions for Travis, and then we'll have more time at the end for questions. So we have a couple that have come in. One was, and Travis, I'll actually, as you're answering, I'll pass the presentation over to Gray to get set up. So one question was, did the group discuss the sectors that might be more resistant to electrifying, such as ag, industrial, or food service?
Yeah, we did, and those are there's a variety of different, the degree to which the barriers apply to each sector varies, and we agree that industrial and ag and food service are probably harder to reach in the near term because of the nature of the technology, but we think all of them can be reached, and we think that focusing on residential programs is very likely to by volume deliver a lot more electrification displacement of non-electrified technologies in the near term, especially. I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Yeah, and in that technology discussion, we did identify a number of industrial only, electrification applications. And just a note on sending out more information. The slide deck I posted has additional content from the technical advisory committees in terms of report outs, research recommendations, and policy implications. And then further discussion from the technical advisory group will be captured in the final written report that'll come out this summer. Okay, a couple more questions coming in here, Travis. As a consumer and someone who cares about my carbon impact, why would I electrify my house when I know that the energy that comes to me is created with fossil fuels?
Yeah, you can. What part of the cost benefit proposition is to calculate the carbon impact of the decision, and in the immediate future it might be close to a toss up, or you'd have to do it depending on your rates that are available to you and any programs like participating in community solar or wind source. The fossil fuel content of the electricity that you use may wind up being comparable, depending on which electrification you're considering, to the non-electric option. But over time, we would expect that electricity is going to become cleaner, and that carbon impact is going to improve over time for the electrification options. And we know even right now that is very likely for a lot of technologies right now to already be a good carbon impact decision, to reduce your carbon impact by going electric. But not in all cases. That's part of the problem, is explaining that and evaluating that.
Yeah, thanks, Travis. So could you comment on what extent, if any, these conclusions, recommendations differ depending on whether you're looking at full electrification or hybrid electric gas systems?
Well, again, that's part of the difficulty, is that you have a lot of options and a lot of moving parts and variables. And in general, I would that there's an optimization problem here, where if you are able to go full electric, you get a lot of savings from disconnecting or not requiring any access to non-electric fuel sources. And then there's that threshold at which, if you need to have backup, that decreases the value of electrification. But that doesn't mean that it's not necessarily valuable over the life cycle. It's just a different math problem. So again, it's all about building these tools that can evaluate the technologies and keeping those tools up to date, and incorporating a lot of different use cases that are available to customers and users.
Thanks, Travis. And then I will comment that we're going to talk a little more about that specific issue in the grid impacts group in a few minutes. Okay, I'm going to give you one more, and then everyone can look in the chat and read other questions, and there's some stories being posted as well. I think that's great. That's one of the benefits of having this a little bit more open. People can interact in the chat a little bit. So for rural homes that utilize LP for their heat, how would you compare the differences in cost for LP versus electricity?
Yeah, so it's another specific use case where you have to, you'd have to incorporate projections for LP costs and the, and electric costs, and compare the technology. It's in principle, it's straightforward enough to compare and say, this is the lifetime cost of using electrified, furnace or whatever you're talking about, heat pump, compared to your LP furnace. and then what kind of backup do you need? And in principle, it's a solvable problem. It's just that we need to do the work to actually build those tools to do those comparisons and actually present the value to the customer, because we can't expect customers to know enough about the technologies to make these decisions independently from programs that can do the help, or train contractors to help present the costs and benefits to them. And that's where we're at in this whole situation, is that the technologies are there. We need to explain how they're valuable and convince customers. And when they're not valuable to customers, don't push them if they're not. Remember that we need to do the evaluation, and when it's beneficial, then apply programs and levers to increase adoption. But if it's not beneficial to the customer, understand those situations as well, so that those are not the first opportunities.
Hey, Carl, do you mind if I jump in real quick?
Yeah, go ahead, Anthony.
It just occurred to me that I neglected to mention an additional card project that speaks directly to something that Travis mentioned. We've also funded a project that Ecometric Consulting is going to be leading to really look, I think, in depth at some of the motivations and barriers regarding contractor and contractor engagement and decision making. And I'll just read the synopsis real quick. It'll provide an in-depth data on the motivations and barriers that drive the decisions of individual heating, ventilation, and air conditioning installers working in residential and small commercial buildings in order to ensure program interventions that are meaningful to decision makers and responsive to market conditions. So I just wanted to throw that in as well.
Thanks, Anthony. Appreciate it. Okay, well, there are some more questions. I will keep note of them so that we can come back to some of those in the group discussion. I want to make sure we stay more or less on our agenda, though, so we don't run out of time for presentations. So thank you, Travis. And Gray has shared, so I think you're good to go now after you unmute, Gray.
Well, thanks for the reminder to unmute, Carl, because I might have been here speaking without anyone hearing me. But I appreciate the opportunity to present for the Metrics Technical Advisory subgroup. As Carl mentioned, we were one of the 3 subgroups that met a number of times to, let's see, sorry, I have to figure out how to advance the slides. Just to kind of level set this presentation on metrics, I wanted to repeat the Technical Advisory Committee's purpose, and that is that the Electrification Action Plan is examining how electrification can serve to reduce carbon emissions, increase energy efficiency, and optimize the electricity system with the aim of developing recommendations for policymakers, regulatory agencies, and utilities. For our part, we at the metric subgroup sought to answer a handful of questions. What's the right methodology for cost benefit testing? How do we quantify those costs and benefits? How do we quantify carbon impacts? What are the rate impacts of electrification? And a handful of other issues. The group met 3 times and benefited from very active participation among the 18 members. And you see the list of the 18 members on this slide. Similar to, I think, the technical advisory group, we had a lot of really good detailed conversations, and some of them were into some some extreme detail just in terms of cost benefit testing and some of those more esoteric topics, but they're particularly relevant, obviously, to the energy efficiency programs, as well as moving to just an electrified future. This is an outline of the topics that I'll be discussing. The first topic is metrics related to cost effectiveness tests. The second is metrics beyond those cost effectiveness tests. The third is electrification in terms of non-energy impacts and why they're important. The last topic is, more research is needed on delivered fuels, and then finally we end with key recommendations. And interspersed, similar to Travis's presentation, throughout this one are, discussion spotlight issues that, where we basically are highlighting an issue for possible additional discussion. So the first item is metrics related to cost effectiveness tests. And the message here is that cost effectiveness tests can incorporate electrification benefits and costs. And the reason that's an important issue is because right now, cost effectiveness as it applies to energy efficiency programs obviously is weighing benefits and costs primarily of programs that are either improving electric or gas efficiency. And the good thing is electrification as a concept is something that can readily be incorporated into cost benefit testing. Now, with respect to cost benefit testing, it's important that the state's priorities are reflected in what's done. And right now, those priorities are laid out in the eco legislation that's been introduced into the legislature. But another key feature or factor is that recent National Standard Practice Manual for Distributed Energy Resources, basically a best practices manual, dedicates an entire chapter to electrification and how you can evaluate in both EE, energy efficiency, and non-energy efficiency contexts. Now, SIP cost effectiveness can already accommodate heat pumps and other electrification technologies. However, there are prohibitions currently on fuel switching, which hinder such investments. And so the SIP framework probably needs to be modified a little bit further to better reflect electrification technologies. And some of this test specifics would be incorporating non-energy impacts, such as health impacts, which are harder to quantify. And an important other aspect of this is the ratepayer impact test. So this is one of the 4 kind of traditional standard cost effectiveness tests. And it may be particularly useful in evaluating electrification because it can test price signals and also evaluate the long-term consequences for the gas system. And basically it's considered the non-participant test, and so it helps assess how tests would how electrification would apply to other features. So a discussion spotlight is how to apply the standard practice cost benefit tests to electrification. As I mentioned, there's a clear path from the National Standard Practice Manual for electrification measures, and SIP cost effectiveness testing can be updated to incorporate the focus on electrification, depending on those fuel switching rules. The Department of Commerce has already kicked off a stakeholder process that's going to be addressing non-energy impact factors in cost effectiveness updates for the 2024 through 2026 triennial. And as I mentioned, Minnesota's eco legislation would also change that metrics discussion if it becomes adopted. And here's just a quick primer. It's a small dive into the details of cost effectiveness testing. But an example is replacing a residential gas and furnace and electric air conditioner with an air source heat pump. And this kind of outlines for you the benefits and the costs. And the benefits of making that change would be avoided gas capacity, avoided gas operation and maintenance costs, avoided indoor emissions. That's a non-energy impact. The cost would be the program cost for running the program, the customer portion of the equipment cost, and the added electricity cost and electric system costs, because you're talking about using more electricity. The items that can be either a benefit or a cost, depending on how they're calculated, are essentially these non-energy impacts. For the most part, with respect to a heat pump, these would be benefits, but those are customer NEIs, environmental impacts, public health, economic impacts, greenhouse gas emissions. And I put a little definition of non-energy impacts because it's a term that I've been using, and this is a definition, you'll see it repeated a little later, but non-energy impacts refers to benefits and costs associated with investments that are not related to the cost to deliver and consume fuels. And usually in this context, we're talking about regulated fuels, electricity and natural gas, because This is a term that's used really in cost-benefit testing related to electric and gas energy efficiency programs. And actually, I meant to mention something that Travis said. I am not on video, but I would do that gesture of one's head exploding because something he said, triggered in my mind a reference to those cost-benefit tests, because there is actually something when you talk in terms of, for example, new construction electrification or all electric buildings, where you have to actually develop new estimates of avoided gas infrastructure costs. And that's probably not something that's yet been developed in Minnesota. It is something that they are in the process of developing in California. And it will become an important factor in evaluating all electric, new construction. So I'm sorry, second topic is metrics beyond cost effectiveness tests. Basically, other metrics besides cost effectiveness tests will be important to measure electrification. What should people know about this? You can set up specific metrics directly related to electrification that align with the goals. It's EV penetration, heat pump penetration, system load factor, et cetera, to track progress and focus efforts. And its factors into any metric, societal cost of CO2, which is one of the primary reasons we would be electrifying, should increase over time because future emissions will produce larger incremental damages. Basically, the effects of avoiding carbon last longer than the lifetime of a lot of equipment. We can also set up metrics, and this is an important item, to track accessibility to and benefits from electrification, such as disadvantaged community participation and benefits, penetration of electrification measures in disadvantaged communities, et cetera. Now, our discussion spotlight on metrics beyond cost effectiveness. Metrics can be prospective and retrospective. Prospective metrics help set goals and priorities based on policy, and then in turn drive actions. And retrospective metrics assess whether goals, penetration of electric measures, disadvantaged community access to benefits, are being achieved. It's a way to measure on an ongoing basis how things, how you're performing against those goals. Examples include metrics that assess CO2 emissions avoided by electrification of transportation, buildings, agriculture, and other sectors, cost-effective alignment of generation and load, and access for disadvantaged customers to electric benefits. And it kind of bears noting that the Minnesota Public Utility Commission has a docket open, CI 17401, on performance-based rate making, which is looking to set up some of these non-cost effectiveness metrics, for example, to assess environmental performance, including carbon reductions, beneficial electrification, and cost-effective alignment of generation and load, including demand response. You can see I'm quoting from that docket. Another discussion spotlight that the group considered very important is equitable outcomes related to electrification. This is a quote we borrow from Ben Passer, who gave a good presentation to the subgroup on equity. And equity means elimination of barriers to full participation in the process and access to the full benefits of the outcome. And it's worth repeating, equity means elimination of barriers to full participation in the process and access to the full benefits of the outcome. And some lessons from past transitions that have occurred. This graphic shows how, we can learn from the past about how major transitions were marked by, equity considerations. Whether you're talking about redlining of neighborhoods and access to universal broadband. As we electrify, it's important that equity considerations are at the forefront. And this is an interesting, framework that Ben also brought to us. And it basically, talks about important factors to consider in the process to follow. In terms of first assessing the community's needs, establishing community-led decision-making, developing metrics and a plan for tracking and ensure funding and program leveraging exists, and then aiming to improve outcomes. And it's worth noting that states like New York have recently passed laws that address directly equity issues. You know, New York's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act actually requires that 40% of the benefits of clean energy initiatives go to disadvantaged communities. I think they're still in the process of kind of developing the details of how they're going to implement that law, but it's an example where they definitely have highlighted the priority of equity considerations. Topic 3, electrification of NEIs are important. To repeat the definition of NEIs, refers to benefits and costs associated with investments in electrification that are not related to the cost to deliver and consume fuels. Examples include valuations for equity, affordability, and clean air. So basically, not every group is impacted the same by electrification technologies and programs. You know, depending on income, depending on geography. And there's more research that's needed to be able to look into this further. And then moving on to our last topic, which is research on delivered fuels. The message here is that more research is needed on the potential of delivered fuels, shifting from delivered fuels to electricity is needed. What people should know about this, delivered fuels primarily in this context refers to propane and fuel oil for heating, cooking, ag, but it can also include petroleum. Generally, natural gas utilities are rate regulated and can recoup the cost in rates, while delivered fuels companies are not regulated. This is an important factor just because we're talking in the context of regulated entities and cost benefit testing, and frankly, the effects that may be incurred by entities that won't be able to sell as much of the product that they offer to customers, such as natural gas utilities being one, but then also oil companies and the service stations and all those other folks, as well as folks who supply other regulated fuels like propane and fuel oil. And some argue that moving individuals away from propane will increase the supply costs to others, which in and of itself has equity concerns. And electrification is going to impact delivered fuel customers differently. For example, ag may be the last sector to switch from propane and may therefore take the brunt of the supply and price effects. So in other words, their supplies get limited and their costs go up, which could have, equity impact. Finally, our key recommendations. So the focus of our recommendations really relate to kind of SIP cost effectiveness, but broader metrics are needed. And our recommendations are to establish a working group to assess the options and necessary changes in cost-effective methodology for electrification and to propose specific changes. That's a SIP-related recommendation. Include non-energy impacts in working group discussions. As I mentioned, there's already an ongoing stakeholder effort to revise or update the SIP cost effectiveness framework, and it'll be important to include these considerations. Third, establish metrics to track achievement of electrification beyond cost effectiveness, especially to track equity considerations. So that's a beyond SIP factor related to electrification. And then finally, conduct more research on the impacts of electrification on delivered fuel customers. And that concludes my presentation. And I think with a handful of minutes to spare, but I can turn it over to you, Carl. I think that's it. Let's see. Click. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Gray. I'll get Jenny set up as presenter, but we do have maybe up to 10 minutes, 5 minutes maybe, to do some Q&A specific to Gray's presentation, if anyone has anything for the chat. So yeah, there's a question here. Have task force discussions included excessive demand charges for commercial high demand heating systems switched from natural gas to electricity? Gray, if you want to take that on as a metrics topic, you can. Otherwise, we can think about it holistically too.
So is the question the larger impacts on the electric system because it will require additional investments in the electric system? I think the answer to that question is yes. that was if you recall the slide where we showed the cost and benefits. Certainly, one of the factors, just even in assessing a utility's investments in, to the extent they're seeking to encourage electrification measures, that has to be part of the framework. You have to consider what the additional demand, the additional system costs will be, both in terms of increased demand and increased energy use, and then the system impacts. Those can't be ignored.
Yeah, and I'll add that Jenny's going to take this topic on in a moment with some content to talk about the potential for the winter peaking to start to be a trend. But in the specific cost benefit testing, there is a consideration for customers. They need to do a little bit enough modeling out of their own energy rate to know if they'd be setting a new demand peak for themselves and whether that would drive their system costs. Like Travis said earlier, figuring out a straight cost for electrification is not always it can be a more complicated calculation.
Right, and it happens on the customer side, at least currently in Minnesota. Residential customers don't have demand charges, right? It applies to commercial and industrial customers. Minnesota moves to time of use and more advanced metering. That certainly could change.
That's a good point. Other questions for Gray? Pause here for a minute.
I know this metrics is an exciting topic.
So, Gray, one of the questions I posed to the group a number of times, I think, and I think it's a complicated ongoing process, is just who owns these metrics at which levels? And I was wondering if you could reflect on that a little bit. Who drives metrics and who tracks accountability on them?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mentioned the PBR docket that the Public Utilities Commission has actually had open, I think, since 2017. So with respect to utilities, it's going to be the Public Utilities Commission that holds the individual utilities responsible. The other metrics, really the context of our discussions are really around the utilities. But, at the end of the day, it's going to be the Utilities Commission that's going to establish the metrics for the utilities and then hold them responsible for them. I think that's probably the most simple answer. And, I don't recall from the eco legislation, but if the eco legislation passes, certainly that will, kind of shift what those priorities are. And, the process, once it passes, will be establishing rules. And then once the rules are established, then the PUC will, seek to implement them with the utilities.
Yeah, Carl, just to add to that, this is Anthony for the Conservation Improvement Program, the cost effectiveness metrics and responsibility through statute with the Department of Commerce, and it's a fairly sort of limited kind of description in statute that will look when assessing SIP programs, will look from the perspectives of society, utility, ratepayer, and participant. As I think Gray mentioned earlier, we have a cost effectiveness committee that really dives deep into that and determines what the inputs should be and provide the investor-owned utilities that information to determine the cost effectiveness of their programs with each SIP filing.
Right. And Anthony makes an important point that I neglected to mention, that the Department of Commerce in Minnesota has, a significant role to play besides the Public Utilities Commission in terms of, tracking those metrics and working with utilities on their cost, their conservation and demand response programs.
Okay, we've got a couple of new questions coming in. I'm going to jump to the end because this one's particularly interesting. So, climate change can be seen as an incoming asteroid. We might be willing to spend an infinite amount of dollars to avoid the impact. How does that kind of thinking get factored into comparative metrics?
Yeah, so an infinite amount of dollars. I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, the reason you have cost benefit testing is that um, it's hard to define infinite in the benefit side of it, whereas the costs are more readily identifiable. So I think it's a fair question. I think I saw another question pop up as to whether the eco legislation has carbon impact. So
Mhm.
to a more kind of specific number than the infinite benefit associated with avoiding catastrophic climate change. The, so there already is a carbon price in the Minnesota cost effectiveness testing. Um, Somebody else can probably speak to whether eco legislation changes that at all. But the PUC has already established a carbon price, at least in the for the energy efficiency and demand response programs. The cost effect, that's actually kind of the one. There are two elements that make the Minnesota cost effectiveness test kind of societal, and that is the carbon price as well as just a different discount rate than the utility weighted average cost of capital.
Yeah, so I would just add two comments there. In terms of infinite amount of dollars, I don't think there's any one solution to climate change that's a silver bullet that's going to solve all the problems, and we could just spend infinite amount of dollars on X. So I think the cost benefit testing becomes valuable, even if you're willing to uncap the amount of money you're willing to spend on something. You still want to understand where your maximum benefits are coming from the dollars spent, so that you're not spinning your wheels, and so you're actually, effectively solving the problem. And so that's really where the cost benefit testing has a use. It can tell us that this dollar spent here has X benefits, and this dollar spent there has X times 2 benefits, and we should do the second one first. And then, one of the levers you can pull in a cost benefit test is to say carbon is worth more, and to show positive to show a positive return on the investment then.
And I think it's the other reason you've seen, folks probably aren't as familiar with seeing ratepayer impact tests kind of show up. And I think it's one of the reasons that ratepayer impact test has kind of creeped in a little bit more into this conversation, because of the discussion about the impact on rates, and for participants and non-participants, as just a metric that can be used to examine those changes.
Okay, an update. Ethan Warner from Centerpoint commented that SIP cost ben is using a carbon pricing from the PUC right now, and ECO does not affect pricing as far as he's aware. That's in the chat for everyone. Okay, well, I think this is great. There was a question about the LP. Let's go there quick, and then we'll turn to Jenny. So with propane, regarding the switch from delivered propane to an electrified home appliances, is this identified as a high impact importance shift in terms of reducing carbon emissions? I think maybe I could answer that, or Anthony could, Gray, unless you have something.
No, go ahead.
I think from the process of this stakeholder process, we were trying to assess where the value in the system is for Minnesota. Where are the most cost-effective improvements? Where are the ones with the most traction? And so certainly, I think when a few years ago, when there was delivered fuel shortages and prices skyrocketed, there was certainly a lot of awareness around that as a barrier. And I think that some of the most cost-effective electrification in Minnesota is switching customers from propane to electric heating. In particular, if it can avoid a midwinter refill at the highest cost per gallon of propane for customers. So there's still work to understand the kind of microeconomics of this for each customer in different parts, in different systems, in different homes. But it's certainly one of the places where there is some economic traction behind electrification. Anything else to add?
No, I don't. Yeah. If Anthony does.
No, right. I mean, it's obviously questions there around what generation profile you're comparing that change to when it comes to carbon emissions and things like that. So So definitely a lot to consider there.
All right. Well, thank you, Gray, again for your presentation. And I will pass it to Jenny now. Did you get the slide?
Great.
Okay.
I have a button that says share. So, hi, everybody. Can you see my screen? Okay. And
Yep, it looks great.
okay, perfect. And I apologize again for not having video, which just slows my connection down too much. So, but great to be here. Yeah, that last question kind of teed up this conversation pretty well. I'm Jenny Edwards, and I'm the Director of Planning and Engagement at CEE, Center for Energy and Environment. And before I start, I do just want to reiterate the thanks to DOE for funding this. I think this has been really helpful and really timely for the state to work through these issues. And thanks to Anthony for sort of leading us through this. And in particular, thanks to Carl for, I think, herding a lot of cats and doing a lot of starting and stopping on this. But I feel like even though we tackled issues at a very high level, I think this whole process has brought some really great conclusions just to sort of say, here's where we are with these issues. So, and thanks to Travis and Gray for your great presentation. So I'm going to pull us up to a high level. Our technical group talked about grid impacts because obviously we're talking about adding a lot of load potentially to the electric system. And so what do we need to be thinking about in terms of the grid? We had the advantage of really being able to look far out into the future. I think that, the feeling is that these aren't necessarily near-term issues, but if we are going to electrify in the areas of especially space and water heating and electric vehicles the way we think we will have to deal with this. It also, we landed on really a systems perspective with this, thinking about the interplay of both the electric and gas systems. And we also recognize, especially from sort of an economic perspective, a lot of these issues have a tipping point. We have sort of, quote, headroom in the near term to be able to pilot and experiment and, see how we can do things like shift load with different rate structures and things like that. So we should be doing that now before we get to potential sort of crisis mode in the future. And then thanks to the folks who took time to give our group presentations, Gary Ambach, Jeff Haas, Patrick Dalton, Nick Dreer, and John here. Those were great and really informed our group. These are the participants who dutifully came to the meetings and filled out Carl's spreadsheets with that. So thanks to you all, and hopefully I'll do a good job representing what were some consensus takeaways from this group. So similar structure to the other two presentations. Our first topic that we tackled was this idea that should we electrify to the extent that we are predicting to meet carbon goals, then we will need to prepare for a shift for the electric grid to be winter peaking in Minnesota. And this is largely because we anticipate a massive uptake of electric heating technologies. So some things to know about this, really back of the envelope calculations from a few sources say that, if we do this to a full extent, the winter peak might be about 2 times larger than the current summer peak in the state. That's sort of unmitigated, but that's the scale that we're talking about. Of course, some utilities in the state already are winter peaking, those that have especially large residential base and where those bases rely a lot on electric heat already. So there's a lot to learn. Our group definitely talked about future resiliency of energy services needing to rely on both the gas and electric system, at least for the near term, and that we focusing on sort of the extremes of an all-electric system are not necessarily how we want to manage the peak winter days. And again, that thinking about that peak winter day is really about what is that single coldest day or the design day for those who do infrastructure planning. That's the most important day, and so there's a lot of carbon that's potentially saved outside of that design day, and so optimizing carbon can get you through a lot of the winter, but from kind of a peaking and a resiliency standpoint, you want to think about the coldest of the cold days. And then another thing to just keep in mind, especially in the space heating side, when we talk about air source heat pumps and how they perform today, on those coldest days, they are switching to a backup system. And that backup system may be electric or maybe fossil fuel based, noting ground source doesn't need this backup. So this is really particular to air source heat pumps. But again, just from a peak standpoint, that's an important thing to keep in mind. This discussion spotlight. So I just wanted to highlight this winter peaking issue. This is a graph of our electric load in 2015, thanks to EPRI, who did this work for GRE. So they did a lot of work to look at current peaking and then modeled peaking in the future under different scenarios. And statewide, we've got basically a similar winter and summer peak. But if you fast forward to 2050 and look at pretty extensive uptake of electric heating and EVs, this is where you get some of that 2x number. So, in this case, maybe more than twice of what we see today moving into our winter peak. So again, this is the scale that we're talking about. Studies like this are useful. I think probably sort of more research into the future about how to mitigate this is needed. But this is the scale we're talking about. And then when it comes to that sort of interplay of the gas and electric system, this is that 2015 data again, but what's overlaid is if you took Minnesota's natural gas demand, this is just from the EIA, in that same year in 2015, and you basically converted that gas demand into megawatts. So all we have are average monthly values for gas, but if you just assumed that that was sort of an average demand, which of course it's not, it goes up and down, but this is how that would convert. So you can see, if we think about what we're adding to the electric system, a lot of it is already provided by the gas system, and we have infrastructure in place to, to provide that sort of quote power when we need it right now. So we would be remiss if we didn't think about how to utilize this infrastructure, I guess, in a way that still minimizes carbon but increases resilience. So that's a spotlight on the winter peaking issue. Next topic is this concept of system load factor. So this whole time we've sort of had this mantra, electrification that improves the system load factor will require controlling this new electric use into low demand periods. Tools to do that include things like grid connected devices, rates, and storage. I think in particular on this topic, electric vehicles have been front of mind for a lot of us, and when people charge those vehicles. So why is this an issue? First bullet, electrification that improves system load factor. Overall, this lowers rates because we won't be sort of increasing the peak demand. We will be, quote, filling in the valleys where demand is lower. So you don't necessarily need to be adding new capacity if you are improving the system load factor. We also note that the way current rates are structured, though, with volumetric rates, that this might be a disincentive to this, and that those may be higher than the actual cost to serve load if what you're doing is filling in valleys. So this was a big takeaway, is to sort of figure out some of that cost to serve depending on when electricity is being added to the grid, and maybe structuring rates to better compensate that. Third bullet, the control of electric technologies can reduce costs to consumers under certain rates. So just sort of a basic statement, but sometimes this is also just about sort of direct control, things like nighttime charging of EVs. And similarly, a lot of tools to do this already exist. So I think like Travis made the comment, right, this isn't necessarily on the R&D standpoint. This is about rolling things out that already exist. Although noting that some controls are still fairly recent and being tested in the marketplace. This issue of filling in the valleys, we also noted, because this is part of the eco legislation as well. It's gotten a lot of conversation. I think in particular, it's important when we think about what we are incentivizing from a policy standpoint. And, you know, something like eco legislation is about essentially the incentive structure, right, to add more electric technologies onto the system, replacing fossil fuels. So to the extent we're incentivizing that, we want to make sure we're incentivizing technologies that aren't increasing peak. Just to spotlight again on that system load factor, what do we mean by that? This was from Gary Ambach's presentation, so thank you, Gary, for this graph. And it just shows what we're talking about. It divides, this is usage over time of day, and it's broken down into the different sectors here at the bottom, but this purple line is the extent, is the peak, overall system peak. So basically it costs more if we're adding electric technologies that increase this peak, and it costs less if we're adding technologies that are filling in this valley. So again, thinking about the case of EVs, this would be nighttime charging of EVs in this area. And you can see why intuitively it's sort of a cost appealing to do that. Third topic, electrification will impact distribution systems. So this isn't just a transmission system issue, but both transmission and distribution infrastructure and natural gas distribution, which will have associated costs with it. So this is about sort of grid planning at the local level. Those distribution costs, again, are determined by the peak day, not necessarily year-round volume. So thinking about that peak design day. Something our group discussed on the natural gas side is, this is very, very back of the envelope, so, you know, don't necessarily quote me on this, but something about $35 a month might be the flat cost to give access to gas as a backup fuel. So that just sort of costs to be hooked up. It's a little different than the monthly service fee, but just the all-in cost, both wholesale and distribution. Another topic we talked about is, in some ways, that smallest level, the most granular level of the distribution system might present the most challenges because it's where you can't even sort of average out the noise as easily. So very, very localized. We may see localized challenges, right? Again, with things like if there's rapid EV adoption in one part of the distribution system, you can't get that averaged out as much as you would thinking about transmission system impacts. Likely no one size fits all solution, so no surprise there, but you know, each part of the grid is going to require potentially a different solution set. And there are, especially with some of the advanced grid investments being made now, there's a bigger toolbox for how to manage some of these things. We also called out that we do not want to create underinvestment in areas of the grid where consumers aren't the first to electrify. So the potential for sort of managing the hotspots, let's say where there's great EV or heat pump adoption, that should not detract from areas, communities that may not be the first to adopt. And that there are cost implications for the quote gas grid, including how much and when costs might increase for remaining customers. I think our group very much called this out as an issue and feels like it's an area that needs a little bit more work. So that's the third topic. A fourth and final topic I just want to highlight from our group. We did spend some time on this carbon intensity question. And we didn't necessarily agree on what the best methodology was to do that. So basically the takeaway is this needs to be determined. How do you assign carbon intensity to different electric loads? That will really change what the assumed carbon benefit is of electrification, and especially in the short term where we do still have a pretty robust mix of fossil fuels and renewable technologies on the grid. So some takeaways here. We don't fully understand what supply dispatch looks like in a high renewables future. So this means that as we are projecting out the impact of technologies that we might start installing today or in the next decade, we've got some modeling results, but we don't sort of have a comprehensive understanding, and it's not a very transparent understanding of what times of the day will be high renewables, what times of the day might we still need gas as a backup fuel, when are we going to be requiring storage. So while some of that information is starting to trickle out at a national level, I think understanding it for Minnesota will be valuable. Also, this sort of carbon accounting question is very different if you're looking at marginal emissions versus average emissions, and I'll spotlight that in a second. Agreement is important. If lowering carbon is the end goal, this really is a critical issue, and it's also critical for our regulators sort of in different parts of the state to be consistent around this, whether it's Department of Commerce or the PUC, or say what the PCA does when they do carbon accounting for the state. So consistency is valuable. Also noting that if we're very focused on the short term of just what might happen in 2022, don't let that disrupt getting to the longer term goals on this issue, given that we know the trajectory we're on as a state. So just a spotlight on that carbon accounting method and what do we mean. This is a graph of MISO's 2018 quote fuel on the margin. Shout out to Lee Shaver at Slipstream. We pulled this from the web, and it's work that he has done. It's just that looks at, again, so the marginal unit being, if you were to turn on or off just 1 megawatt, what type of plant would turn on or off? Is it a coal plant, a gas plant, wind plant? Shows that the majority of time across a day, gas is the fuel on the margin in 2018. But coal is still the fuel on the margin a fair amount of the time in MISO. Less frequently wind and hydro, of course. This is, I'm actually not positive if this is MISO as a whole or MISO North, so excuse that. And so the marginal fuel is quite frequently a fossil fuel, is the takeaway from this, which would give very high, a high carbon value to some of these electrification technologies. But the challenge of the marginal fuel is it's very hard to predict in the future, and it's changing rapidly. I think more and more things like wind are the marginal fuel. So when you think about forecasts, it's challenging. It's also unclear how often something like a large tranche of EVs should be considered the marginal load versus other loads that are on the system. So lots to discuss here. I think I'll point out just some other results, and this is from a recent Department of Commerce funded card grant led by Slipstream, and my organization and Raycon Energy were also on this team. It just showed, we did some accounting to look at either the marginal rate, the average rate. What if you just took statewide instead of MISO? What if you looked at a specific Minnesota utility? And it just shows the large variation that you can get in emissions factors. So just underscoring this issue does matter and needs more consideration. Just the key takeaways, summarizing all this up, last slide from our group. We thought that this integration of gas and electric information, it would be great from a sort of quote grid and resiliency standpoint to see these integrated in planning, and what are the interplays of gas and electric on things like those design days. Second recommendation is to further investigate this cost to serve for the electric grid and gas system, and especially using that to help set appropriate rates. Third is work to achieve consensus on the methodology for accounting for carbon. And then fourth, we really thought something like an electrification potential study would be hugely valuable, especially one that might indicate where in the state we anticipate these new technologies coming online. That would really help predict some of the grid impacts that we might expect to see in the state. So that is it from me. And thanks to all. Happy to take questions or have discussion.
Thanks, Jenny. So a couple dedicated questions for you, and then we can pivot to anyone or any topic. So Kevin Lawless asked if the EPRI chart with the natural gas overlay included the gas used for electric generation in that gas peak.
Oh, thank you for that, Kevin. It's almost like I set you up with that question. I meant to say, no, it does not. So this is just end use, industrial, residential, commercial. So yeah, more of an apples to apples comparison. Thanks for that.
Awesome. And then, so then a question here, as renewable penetrations approach 70% of regional energy use, it appears that inter-regional transmission becomes necessary to avoid curtailments of renewable resources. So did we look at high voltage grid overlay requirements between ISOs in order to serve Minnesota's electrification goals?
Yeah, I think that's also a good point. And we did not look at that. I think, the assumption we were really thinking more on the demand side versus the supply side. So that's a big question to think about based on where some of this load growth might be happening and when it is happening. Is it realistic to think that this future increased renewable supply can actually get to this load? And I think that is something that is being worked on in other forums, but it is worth, I think, a question of whether, the space that we're occupying now of really the demand side portion of things, what should we assume about renewables access? So it's a good question.
And then going back to the winter peak content, there was kind of two related questions. One, does the projected winter peak demand slide include transportation along with building electrification? And then a comment about future winter peak being exacerbated by EV deployment with winter range diminishing because winter range diminishes greatly, requiring additional charging.
Good questions. I will take a crack at it, and then I don't know if Jeff Haas is on the call if you want to jump in if I'm wrong about anything here. But so this again was a study that EPRI did for the state of Minnesota. Yes, it does include EVs in this, EVs as well as electric heating. They modeled a bunch of different scenarios, and I think this is sort of an economy-wide scenario to get at 80% carbon reduction. So there's a lot of assumptions embedded in this about how much electrification is happening. And then, sorry, remind me of the second part of the question again.
More of a comment just around the range being diminished in the winter,
right?
Both because of battery effectiveness and then heating the car in EVs, so the peak becomes higher in the winter.
Right. And yes, Jeff confirming transportation's included. I don't know how much EPRI looked at that issue. I think it is a good issue to look at. I know we've in my organization taken a look at some of that. There's range issues around the battery. There's also heating issues in the winter of just how, we're not driving around with our cars at 20 degrees. So given that that's an electric draw, how that heat is provided to the EV actually in some ways makes more of a difference than just the range issues. So I know EPRI's pretty sophisticated organization. I'm guessing that they thought about that a bit, but I don't know how thoroughly they would have modeled that. And again, Jeff, if you want to chime in on that, otherwise happy to follow up on that.
Yeah, hi Jenny, this is Jeff, and yeah, you kind of nailed it on, as far as the work that EPRI did. It was really It did acknowledge the fact that the usage was higher during the winter months. And I think speaks to some of the strategies as well as the technology evolution of EVs that, as the battery range, as the overall range of EVs gets larger, the ability to shift that load around outside of those peaks becomes more apparent, and that degradation in terms of mileage and range may not have as direct of a consumer effect that would require such a peaking dynamic to occur. But there is also a comment about that other evolution that is happening on the vehicles, which is related to heat pump integration into EVs, which can also help the range issue. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Jeff.
There's one more question I was going to grab here. Let me look for it.
Cool.
Do we have an understanding of how air source will impact winter peak versus ground source?
Yeah, I think we do have some understanding of that. And others, please chat if you know more than I do. But obviously, a ground source heat pump uses the ground's temperature, right? So they don't have this the same issue of drop off of COP on those very cold winter days. So, in theory, they're still chugging along as a ground source heat pump, which has the associated electric draw. If you are using an air source heat pump today, you are looking at those very cold winter days, and you have a backup system because of the drop off of the air temperature. So depending on what that backup system is, I mean, there's scenarios where that's propane fuel. And so in a sense, you are not drawing electricity from your heat pump. That's, cost implications are, different for each of those, right? And that's in an air source heat pump, you need the cost of that backup system, and a ground source you don't, but you have other costs associated with ground source. So trade-offs there. But yeah, I think big picture, that's the difference.
Thanks, Jenny. That's a great answer. Okay, so there's been some good additional comments from people in the chat. So definitely, if you don't have your chat open, you're missing out on learning things from the smartness of this group. I'm gonna like pivot to full, questions about anything, any of the three groups, technologies, metrics, or grid impacts, questions that are more pan group, and then also open it up to members of the technical advisory committee who want to, add comments or from their experience being part of this. And of course, if any attendees have something they'd like to say, we can open this up too. I can maybe just to keep it orderly, if you want to make a comment, if you want to raise your hand, we'll try that. I think it'll show up in the chat, and I can call on you, so we kind of go one at a time. Okay, so Gary chatted that many of the winter peaking analyses include an assumption of the continuation of aggressive energy efficiency through SIB. And that's a really good point that actually hasn't come up in any of the presentations. Most of the models of the future do include energy efficiency. So yeah, in none of these forecasts do we think energy efficiency is done. In fact, it becomes more important. And then Brian asks, have any of the groups discussed the potential for securitizing some stranded natural gas distribution assets in an effort to both reduce investment risk and mitigate the bill impact for customers who continue using significant amounts of natural gas? And then Alexis told me I should teach everyone how to raise their hand. So that's actually a fair question. I haven't. I think there's a little emoji icon on the bottom next to like your leave the meeting. And then you can click raise your hand, and then it should show your hand raised in the participant log. Yeah, so I don't know. I really can't speak to securitizing stranded natural gas assets. Does anyone feel like they could take that on? Otherwise, it's an interesting topic for future thought.
I'm definitely not going to take that on, but I just want to make sure others from the group chime in as needed on things.
Yeah, so definitely, if any of the members of from the TAC have want to answer a question or feel like something's missing, go ahead. Okay, yeah. So I think I saw Kevin had his hand raised using the wonderful hand raising icon, so we can call on him. Kevin Lawless, go ahead. Do I have to unmute you?
Yeah, no, I think I got it.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Yeah, I thought all the presentations today were really good, so thank you everyone. Learned a bunch, even though I participated in some of the groups. It's just kind of a general comment. It seems like one of the things that go hand in hand with electrification is storage. And it seems like we have kind of underplayed that throughout this work, and I'm just wondering if others kind of feel the same way.
Yeah, can you tell us a little more, Kevin, around what you're thinking with storage?
Well, obviously the costs of storage are coming down rapidly, and are on the same kind of cost curves, although somewhat behind what we've seen in wind and solar. But they're going to catch up, and storage is, energy storage may have an ability to impact kind of what Jenny showed with the winter peaking becoming predominant. It just seems like, utility scale storage would be something that certainly could mitigate that. So.
Yeah, so I would just from a high level guiding this process perspective, you have to pick and choose what you're going to focus on. And I think in this process, we didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the supply side of energy. We were more focused on the demand side, the customer interactions, the programmatic kind of delivery. So it's a really good point that storage is an important component, especially if we're really tying it back to Jenny's comments around marginal emissions and how do we reduce carbon. That's the ultimate goal here for most of these policies or programs. And so storage then can play a role in making things more carbon effective.
I might have another comment to add there. I think that a lot of this is contractor or customer end use facing. And when we're talking about developing these tools to present the value proposition to customers, there's a lot of behind the scenes things that go into calculating what that value is, including cost of carbon and avoided costs and alternatives, and things like storage or transmission, or comparing industry trends. Those are things that would be behind the scenes in those tools, but certainly those things are continually changing. And so one of the important point would be, as we're developing these tools, we have to remember to keep them up to date, and somebody has to be responsible for maintaining these tools and being aware of these trends and making sure that these cost effectiveness evaluation tools are continually updated with an ever-changing and improving, hopefully, market overall that has a lot of inputs behind the scenes.
And thanks to people chatting, some more comments around storage and its importance. That's great feedback for me to have as I'm thinking about what to pull into a final report here. So I wanted to go back. Richard flagged that I had a question. He had a question around maintenance and kind of redundancy of equipment that he's looking at in his school. Actually, Richard Schulte, right? Do you mind unmuting and ask your question? Oh, you sound like a chipmunk, like very high pitched. Okay, I don't think that's working. I'll ask your question for you. So he says in his school, they have two heat exchangers, gas to water and water to air. In advanced ground source units, there appear to be 4 heat exchangers, water to water, water to refrigerant, and refrigerant to water, and then water to air. All of that equipment looks like a threat for high maintenance and corrosion costs. And so did we address the maintenance expenses long term? And I feel like there's two kind of questions there. One is a metrics question. How do you incorporate the maintenance costs into a technical evaluation? And then the other is just a technology question. Does electric equipment have higher maintenance costs over the life? So anyone willing to take those questions on? I'm wondering if any of our geothermal or air source experts from the tax would be willing to comment on maintenance costs. Did I see Scott was on the phone?
Yeah, this is Scott. So the reality of the heat pump is we're just moving energy, right? So we're not experiencing the extreme temperatures of ignition and combustion. So in moving temperatures, we may have a heat exchanger once, twice, or 3 times to pull out more efficiency. But the ongoing rated life of this equipment, based on the American Society of Heating and Cooling Engineers, rated life is 25 years on average, almost 10 years more than any combustion system. And the maintenance and service on these is very little, but it all comes back to that contractor and how that system is designed. But there is very little maintenance on these systems. You've got to keep your drain pan clean. You've got to keep your coils clean. You've got to maintain your quality of your water or your heat exchange media. But outside of that, the maintenance is not really that large with a typical heat pump.
Thanks, Scott. Other questions or topics? We got about 10 minutes left. Any other comments from people who are attending today? Things that they wish the rest of the stakeholders, have a chance to hear? Oh, yeah, this is good. Thanks, Rob, for reposting this question. So most commercial and industrial customers are tasked with reducing their energy use and spend. How do you overcome that barrier to get to a point where they are willing to entertain long-term savings, particularly when it may involve fuel switching? That question was posted when Travis was speaking, so I might give Travis a chance to respond.
Yeah, and I'm gonna shut my video off here. I don't know if I'm having bandwidth issues, and hopefully, can you hear me, or am I breaking up?
No, you sound fine.
Okay. Well, I think that there's 2-level answers here. Well, one is, again, we just need to understand all the use cases as well as possible and build cost benefit analyses as high resolution for each use case as well as possible, and then it'll depend on the individual customer if they're willing to entertain long-term savings. That's something that we may not be able to. That may not be a lever we can pull to help them change the term of their outlook window for how long term they're looking for savings. But if we can build a case that those long-term savings exist, that's step one, and then we can present it to them and make that offer to customers. And then the other piece is, I think that this is where we have to be very careful, is these use cases that have the longer the term and the more complicated the equipment, the more assumptions that are built in, the more tedious or more precarious the cost benefit analysis is. And so that's where we're really looking at next steps, is really learning to understand how to build these costs and benefits and weigh them. And so I think it boils down again to building these tools to better understand cost benefit, and then just scaling it up to commercial and industrial and longer term. And in principle, it's not, it's the same problem. It's just it's a more impactful problem at a larger scale. So I don't know if that really answers it, but I think that's, when it gets down to it, that's the answer.
Yeah, I would add that one topic that came up in the technology group, I believe, was about rates, and utilities offering a low electric heating rate can be a really big decision factor in terms of whether a technology is cost effective for a customer. And that might also apply to industrial and commercial customers. Is there a dual fuel rate that the utility can offer, if there's some backup options, so that you can really, channel this energy consumption into the valleys when electricity is really cheap to offer. Because ultimately, I think for C&I customers, if it doesn't save some money or at least come out as neutral, it's going to be very difficult, at least in the short term. Carbon pricing could change, could upend the economics of this in the future. But for the moment, there's a narrow set of technologies that look like they can offer immediate cost savings. And I think you should also, especially with industrial customers, think about the non-energy benefits, such as maybe quicker response time in a production manufacturing setting or something like that. That could really, you start to see a payback because of more, faster process or something like that. Okay, so then Gary says, getting back to storage, it seems that considering Minnesota geography, there may be an opportunity for microgrids incorporating distributed energy resources, including storage, all interconnected to improve grid flexibility and resiliency. Yeah, there's a great trend here, a great line of comments on this chat around storage. Does anyone else want to take on more discussion of storage? Jenny, do you have anything else to add on storage right now?
I think it's a great, I probably don't track the costs, the commercial cost of storage as much as some others do. So, I think watching those come down is really interesting. I think I'd say, just like the framework we have for efficiency, which is it is a resource, just like power plants. I think some of the electrification opportunities offer sort of storage in our buildings and in our loads. So I know I started my career 20 years ago working on vehicle to grid battery stuff, and that's still, like nuclear fusion, it's still always sort of 20 years in the future. But I think it's really just worth keeping that in mind, as well as the sort of thermal storage of our buildings. If they truly are tight as we electrify them, that's short, they have the ability to shift in short time scales. So I think that's a piece of the storage question. And I think, the microgrid question is also one that really tackles resiliency and the ability of an area to island in the event of larger grid outages is really the promise there. And we might not, I think oftentimes the value of keeping the lights on during outages is a cost that's put on the customer, should they want increased reliability beyond what the grid offers. And it might be worth just sort of thinking about the societal benefits to some of those things when it comes to certain parts of the grid. So.
Thanks, Jenny. And then I see a comment question. Will nuclear be a major component to solving the electrification duct curve issues? If so, has the TAC discussed retrocommissioning and retrofitting financial support to mitigate increased nuclear waste storage concerns? I can answer from the TAC perspective that we did not address nuclear and it goes to this earlier comment. It's not that we didn't address nuclear. We just didn't spend a lot of time actually looking at supply side, decarbonization of the grid. I think we just kind of took an assumption that the grid is decarbonizing at a pretty steady rate over the last 20 years, and that will continue, especially with some of the utility commitments. Now, what exactly the fuel mix is to get us there is, of course, a process that's in the works still. All right, I just did a scroll through to see if there's any other hands raised. I think maybe I'll just let Anthony offer some concluding comments. I think we've had a great discussion, and I do really appreciate the comments. I'm going to spend a little more time reading through those myself. And if you want to add, I'll put my email here in the chat. If you want to get a hold of me with additional comments after this meeting, I welcome that, and it will be used in the work of formulating the final report.
Yeah, thanks, Carl, and yeah, thanks to everyone for the comments and the questions today. As so Carl's alluded to, this isn't the sort of final opportunity to react to what's been presented and how the conversation has been going today. So please do forward us information and comments for the rest of this month, and then our hope is at that point that we'll retreat to a quiet spot and work on making some sense of everything that's taking place to date, and hopefully come up with a sort of comprehensive summary of those things and recommendations based on the conversations that we can present later this year. So thanks as always to Carl for his work on this, to the advisory committee speakers and volunteers as well. And we'll look forward to hearing from everyone soon. And with that, Carl, I'll pass it back to you.
All right, yeah, thank you, Anthony. Thank you all for attending. The one last time, I will also post the source for presentations from today, and I'll get the recording of the webinar posted there within the next 3 days or so. It gets published. Thanks for everyone's time today. Look forward to any questions you send me afterwards.